relatively pro-American, arguing that we shouldn't measure defense in defense. We should measure it in development funds. And from a foreign policy point of view, there's something to be considered there. But from a defense point of view, that was kind of a little wonky. So that has come back from the brink, if you will. But we're just not seeing the mobilization in Europe that would be necessary for this to stick. It's not just that they're heavily reliant upon the United States. It's that the sort of societal shift that is necessary to get us back to where we were during the Cold War in terms of mindset. We just haven't tripped past that yet. There seems to be a general belief, especially in places like Germany, that this is going to stay in Ukraine. And as long as it stays in Ukraine, there is the option of going back to where we were 10 years ago. And I don't think it's really sunk in everywhere yet that that world is gone. Now, yesterday, 2 days ago, when the nuclear threats became explicit, that might be enough to push us over. We'll see, and we'll know soon.
They've been explicit since the beginning, and in
the last 48 hours, I think, from my point of view, it has really amped up a lot. We actually had yesterday, when I was flying in from Vancouver, an evolution in the Russian pro-war communication, because they thought they had expressly threatened Berlin, France, and Stockholm and the rest. But most people in the West interpreted it as a nuclear threat against Ukraine. And so they went out and had to clarify, and that was a little chilling.
Well, I've thought it's pretty chilling since the beginning, but I'm wondering, what exactly would you expect to see if you thought the message was really getting through? Would you see?
Oh, that's pretty straightforward. We need at least 3 NATO divisions in the Central European countries hard up on the Ukrainian border. If the goal is to really dissuade the Russians and to convince them that this is something where the West is one and the West is going to act and the West is not going to is going to be ready for whatever's after Ukraine, you have to have troops on the edge.
Yeah, I agree. Do you think that our failure to put the troops there, or to insist that they be put there, is owed to a failure to appreciate the threat, or is it owed to what do you think is going on with the Biden administration?
I think the Biden administration is working with the toolbox that it has. It's a little bit constrained in the United States, not as much as the past 3 presidents, which is actually, significant progress. And I don't necessarily think that this is a failure of the Biden administration to act. It's a failure of capacity on the European side. There just aren't a lot of European countries that have forces that are even capable of deployment at this point. So the toolkit that we would have just reflexively reached for in the Cold War, we've bit by bit denigrated and demobilized that over the course of the last 30 years. Canada and Germany are probably the best 2 examples here. They've largely given the Ukrainians most of the equipment that they're capable of giving at this point, because they haven't really built out any of their military capacity since the Cold War ended. So if you want to go to that old conversation of security consumers versus security providers, they're absolutely on the consumer side at the moment. And the sort of build out that would be necessary to field troops in those 2 countries, if they started today, is at minimum a 6-month process. Well, we're now in month 7 of the war, and it still hasn't happened.
It's a little strange that people aren't behaving more as if this is a 5-alarm fire. I wonder why they aren't. Do you have any thoughts about that?
Well, let's take a page from the Spanish book. By the way, the Spanish have wildly overperformed in this. They're not a border state, and they've sent a huge amount of help to the Ukrainians. The way the Spanish look at this is that security is something that the Americans take care of. Now, that means that you can play fast and loose with the international politics and let the Americans pay the price, and that's fun. But at the end of the day, they are a peripheral economy in the far western end of Europe, and if something really does go wrong, the Americans will be there. And there's a degree of trust and belief in that statement. That permeates throughout Europe. The thing is, we've had 20 years of the war on terror. We had the war in Iraq that, regardless of whether you thought it was a good idea or a bad idea, the Americans were not exactly thrilled with how the Allies stepped up. Now, we all agree that the Russians are a problem and the Americans are now stepping up, but there's certainly, it's not all water under the bridge. So when the institution is weaker, when the recent record of collaboration is weaker. And 6 months on, aside from a admittedly substantial amount of weapons transfers to the Ukrainians, no one's really changing anything. They're just waiting for the Americans to act, and the Americans are still in their rest, recuperate, rearm, retrain cycle after the wars on terror. This is something that doesn't necessarily resonate well in Washington. Now, on a foreign policy point of view, the United States is probably more united than at any time since 2002, which, considering where our politics have been, wow, thank you, Vladimir Putin, we kind of needed that. But it's going to take time to build out the stuff that we need. The Russians are clearly seeing this with their military deployments, but the same applies to us.
Yeah. What happens if Trump is elected again?
I'm not going to make a prediction on that at this point. The belief in Moscow was that if we had a second Trump administration instead of a Biden administration, that in the first year he was going to functionally withdraw the United States from NATO, and he could just walk in Ukraine and take whatever he wanted. It wasn't until that didn't go that direction, and the javelins started ending up on the front line, that the Russians felt they needed to move. If Trump were to come in a year or two, the problem with predicting what Trump is going to do is he literally just makes it up as he goes. And anyone who comes into the room with advice or background is somebody he either fires or won't let talk. If he stays true to form, if he continues what he did in his first term, I would expect the weapons deliveries to stop on a dime. Now, he's erratic on a good day, so you don't know how that is going to play out. But it was very clear that he personally disliked Zelensky. And so I can totally see him doing his normal thing and allowing his personal umbrage to drive policy. Yeah. In a larger sense,
I want to understand, for one thing, why you think China is going to collapse and why your prediction about this is so different from everyone else's, and whether this is a matter of the initial conditions being just slightly different and getting a massively different picture. You start with China's new numbers, and the intelligence community and the UN start with the numbers as they were 2 years ago. And one of them's got China being the United States' biggest competitor. The other one has China being a very significant country, and you've got it collapsing. What's the difference?
I would say most of the world's coming around to my way of thinking, especially over the last 6 months. Let me give you two things. I mean, there's a dozen major reasons that I don't think the Chinese system is going to survive this decade, but let me give you the two that are absolutely unassailable. First of all, China is the third most internationally integrated country in the world after the Germans and the Koreans. They are utterly dependent upon globalized access to raw materials and markets the world over. They import the raw materials, they import the technology, people forget that piece sometimes, and then they export the finished goods. That does not work without a globalized world, and there is no coalition of countries that can replace the United States as the guarantor of that world. And with the Americans going their own way, that's it. The entire economic model doesn't work. Semiconductors is probably the best space to see how exposed the Chinese are. They can't make the high-end or the mid-end chips, and they can't make the equipment to make the low-end chips. They are completely dependent upon tech transfer